Okay, in the second part of this lecture, we're looking at the changes that happened in the 20th century that don't quite fit the traditional labour history chronology, that are still really important and only recently been acknowledged as significant in labour history. So, as I mentioned in the previous part, the early 20th century is dominated by general strikes of the major trade unions and is very sort of political, situated around the big unions and their political sort of clout and demands. But there are other strikes that begin to change that history, and they occur, as with most of the changes in this module, after the end of the Second World War, where the socio-economic changes with new generations thinking about human rights, inspired by the new thinking in the 1940s around equality for all. We see different types of strikes and new rights being claimed. And so in our intersectional model, women's rights come into that quite quickly. And we see the rise of unskilled labour, again, demanding their rights, but also skilled women's labour, demanding a new form of union politics, if you like. The most famous of which is the Ford machinist strike at Dagenham in 1968, which was centred around the slogan "equal pay for equal work." And there was a relatively recent film and now a successful musical called Made in Dagenham around that event and that strike, which portrayed it as a feminist victory, all about equal pay. But as historians, we've got to be careful. Actually, the women's demands were about the grading. So the machinists were claiming that they should be upgraded to a higher grade because their skill in sewing machine operating was as skilled as some of the men and other female workers who were operating at a higher grade doing other types of work. And there were hundreds of these grading disputes across the country at different manufacturers. And in fact, the fact that it was women who were putting forward that claim in some respects is less important than this debate over grading. But the Dagenham strike seemed to capture the zeitgeist of the moment, and the machinist case was very much about grading. It wasn't about women's pay, equal pay. Actually, they were most angered by discrimination against them as skilled workers, not necessarily as women. And it was the male trade union leadership who transformed the strike into one that was more generally about equal pay. The women themselves argued, quote, "We don't want to confuse the issue and get mixed up with politics." And I think that's partly because of the previous general strikes that had become very political, enmeshed in parliamentary politics rather than in the everyday lives of workers. But as a result of the strike, it eventually led to the Equal Pay Act of 1975, which prohibited any less favourable treatment between men and women in terms of pay and conditions of employment. It didn't quite enforce the principle of equal pay for work of equal value, but it did have an impact. And so between the strike and the passage of the Act, women's hourly earnings began to rise and to eventually become about 67% equal to men. So not a major victory. We still haven't reached levels of 100% equality to male earnings, but it had risen from about 59% to 67%. But the other element of how the economy was changing, in some respects, the machine workers were at the start of the decline of the manufacturing industries in Britain and in Western Europe to some extent. And so these skilled workers were being overtaken by automation and by cheaper unskilled workers. And we're moving into a changing global economy. And with decolonisation and the, the the formation of the Commonwealth, with the decline of the empire, we see a changing global economy in which migrants moved to Britain initially from the Commonwealth to take unskilled jobs and were prepared to do so much lower pay. And this created tensions, obviously, in a period of heightened racial tensions. Anyway, the economy and the economic issue caused more tensions. So this is just a quick map of kind of the current situation. Obviously, it will change after Brexit, but predominantly in the earlier period, British immigrants to Britain were coming from former British colonies such as Kenya, Uganda, where they'd been expelled, and also from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, to work in generally low-skilled and low-paid jobs. And more recently, we've had a lot of immigration, we know, from the rest of the EU. This creates all sorts of other intersections between identities, ethnicities, cultural and social belongings, which were manifested in Labour politics. So an earlier example from the 1960s were questions over religious and cultural rights, and the famous case of the Wolverhampton bus drivers, who the dispute began when a 23-year-old bus driver employed by Wolverhampton Transport Department had been off sick and then came to work with a full beard and said that he was entitled to have a beard because of his cultural and religious beliefs, and he was ordered to shave or go home from work, and he did. He went home, and he was backed by the Indian Workers Association, who said he had the right to work. He didn't have to fulfil the uniform regulations of the transport department. It's important in this case was actually the bus drivers union, the Transport and General Workers Union. Although it did intervene, the local union branch was reluctant to get involved and only got involved after pressure from its Sikh members. And it argued eventually to ask for a rule change on beards as well as turbans. But this was in contrast to its original position, which had been shaped again by the more traditional white skilled labour movement that had been part of the trade union for a much longer time. It'd been torn by three issues: debates over immigration, how much it's the union's role to influence government policy on immigration. Secondly, the hostility of its white members to the new East Asian immigrants who'd come to work in the West Midlands, and inside the union itself, and there's still prolonged suggestion that immigrant members should be treated differently. So it's not a straightforward progressive case. There is division within the union itself over the rights of its members, and the context of the late 1960s is also important because of widespread concern about immigration, the rise of racism. So in the West Midlands, 1968, in April 1968, the MP for Wolverhampton South West was Enoch Powell, and he gave his most famous, infamous Rivers of Blood speech, which represented all the intolerance of British cultural and religious life within a sort of right-wing tradition. And so this was the overall context of why this strike was, and this dispute was so inflammatory. And the various ethnic minority communities felt let down, not just by the employers who seemed to be siding with these racist beliefs, but also white workers within the unions who also didn't want to get involved, and to some extent supported what were called colour bars, in defence of their own employment. So the Transport and General Workers Union remained silent on the issues, even though the Labour Party itself was supporting the Sikh community. The Race Relations Act was passed in 1968, at the same time as the Commonwealth Immigration Act, which tried to limit Commonwealth immigration. So, incredibly tense period for the relationship between white workers and workers from the former Commonwealth. This also became an issue with Asian workers who'd come from the ex-British East African colonies of Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda, particularly those from Uganda who'd been expelled by Idi Amin in 1972. And the key strike that we're looking at in this module is the Grunwick strike, the film processing factory at Grunwick, which had employed a lot of migrant women workers, particularly Indian women who'd come from East Africa. And a group of workers in 1976, on the 20th of August, led by a woman who was going to become famous as one of their main spokespersons, Jayaben Desai, walked out in protest against the poor treatment that they'd been receiving at the processing plant. They'd had all sorts of grievances about discrimination, to general sort of everyday oppression, like not being able to go to the toilet, and being shouted at, and generally working in very poor and pressurized conditions. They walked out and tried, and then joined the trade union, the Association of Professional, Executive, Clerical and Computer Staff, or APEX, and began to demand that Grunwick film processing site should recognise their right to join a trade union. It didn't recognise that right. It picketed the factory for several months, and importantly, it achieved mass support from many other unions. There were lots of demonstrations, and in particular, the Union of Postal Workers, who delivered the photographs that they were processing, went on strike and boycotted postal services to and from the plant. But in some respects, it was a failure because the big unions, again, did not want to intervene. Both the Trade Union Congress and APEX felt the dispute couldn't be won and wanted to pull out, and effectively withdrew their support. And it was the leadership of Desai and the other migrant women who decided to go further. They mounted a hunger strike outside the TUC headquarters, but eventually they had to call off the strike because they could not get the backing from the TUC. The strikers felt abandoned and disillusioned. The significance of the strike is multifaceted. You've read the blog Hatful of History, and there's a quotation that is cited in that article about how this the strike reflected lots of different positions, and the different unions and different social movements saw in the site what they wanted to see, and used the strike as a way of arguing for their own case. And this is hugely reflective of intersectionality, but also is problematic because it doesn't necessarily reflect what the women workers themselves wanted. And we'll look at how that sort of reflects on more modern strikes, in particular the Gate Gourmet strike of 2005, which in some respects is very similar. It also failed. It was also led by migrant Indian and East Asian women who had some similarities with the Grunwick processing strike, but others that we'll look at, such as the difficult relationship they've had with other immigrants, and in this much more neoliberal, 0 hours global economy in which they were employed.